You've probably had a neighbor who played music a little too loud, or maybe let their dog run into your yard a little too often. But what if we told you that some neighbors out there are arguing over things so strange, so petty, and so downright bizarre that you'll find it hard to believe they're real? These aren't your average noise complaints or fence line disagreements. These are the kinds of disputes that involve secret tunnels, backyard surveillance drones, and accusations so wild they'd make a soap opera writer blush. Welcome to the weirdest neighbor disputes in the US, where the line between reality and satire gets blurrier with every new story. All across America, people are turning suburbia into battlegrounds over the most unexpected things, like the color of a garden gnome, the ownership of a single tree branch, or even the alleged theft of sunlight. It's a world where passive-aggressive notes escalate into full-blown feuds, and where something as simple as a misplaced trash can ignite a years-long Cold War. These stories aren't just entertaining, they reveal something deeper about human nature, about how easily pride and pettiness can take over when we live just a little too close to one another. And yet, for all the frustration they cause, there's a strange comfort in knowing that no matter how odd your own neighbor might be, someone out there has it even weirder. So get ready, because we're about to pull back the curtain on some of the most jaw-dropping, head-shaking, and utterly unbelievable neighbor disputes you've ever heard. From legal battles over imaginary property lines to revenge plots involving Christmas decorations and flamingo lawn ornaments, these tales prove that truth really is stranger than fiction. And who knows, by the end of this, you might just feel a little better about the folks next door. Our first stop is in an otherwise peaceful Oregon neighborhood where a simple act of patriotism spiraled into a full-blown legal war. It all started when one homeowner, feeling a profound sense of national pride, decided to make a statement. They invested in a monumental symbol, a towering 45-foot flagpole planted firmly in their own backyard, from which they flew a massive American flag every single day. To them, it was a beautiful, stirring tribute to the nation, but for the family living next door, this grand gesture quickly became a daily nightmare. They described the constant, rhythmic thwump-thwump-thwumping of the giant flag fabric as an unbearable noise pollution, a sound that penetrated their walls at all hours and made peaceful afternoons in their own garden impossible. Then there was the issue of the shad. This enormous pole and its flag cast a long, dark shroud over their property, blocking precious sunlight and creating a perpetually gloomy atmosphere. And visually, they argued, what was intended as a proud symbol had become a garish eyesore that dominated the entire neighborhood's view. What followed was a classic, bitter feud that moved from heated backyard shouting matches all the way into the cold, formal arena of the courtroom. The arguments were deeply philosophical, pitting two very American ideals directly against each other. On one side was the sacred right to free expression and the proud display of national symbols on one's own private property. On the other was the right to peaceful enjoyment of that same property, free from what one could argue was a privately created nuisance. Lawyers debated obscure noise ordinance decibel levels, drafted diagrams showing the precise angle of the shadow at different times of day, and argued over zoning laws that were never written with the 45-foot pole in mind. This wasn't just a simple argument over a flag, it was a fundamental clash of values, a microcosm of the eternal struggle between individual liberty and community harmony. The case dragged on for years, consuming time, money, and any hope of a friendly neighborhood relationship, proving that even the most noble of symbols can become a weapon in the wrong context. While the flagpole feud was a battle over noise and shadow, our next dispute takes us to an entirely different battleground, the subjective world of taste and psychological torment. In a meticulously manicured, upscale Florida community where pristine lawns and tasteful landscaping were the norm, one homeowner decided to make a rather dramatic statement. They acquired a collection of grotesque, life-sized gargoyle statues, creatures with twisted faces, snarling mouths, and imposing wingspans, and installed them with precise intention along their property line. Each stone-faced sentinel was positioned to stare directly into the windows and backyard of the house next door. To the homeowner, these were pieces of Gothic art, a unique expression of their personal style. But for the family living beside them, it was nothing short of an invasion. They described waking up each morning to the sight of these menacing figures looming outside their breakfast nook window, casting eerie shadows across their patio. They argued the installation was a deliberate and malicious act designed not to beautify but to intimidate, creating what their lawyer would later call a visually hostile environment. The case that followed was anything but ordinary, pushing the legal system to confront questions it rarely entertains. Can a neighbor's choice of garden gnomes, flamingos, or gargoyles cross a line from mere eyesore into actionable harassment? The courtroom became a forum for debating the very nature of art, fear, and property rights. Expert witnesses were brought in, art historians to discuss the gargoyle's traditional role as a protector, and psychologists to testify on the potential for such imagery to cause genuine emotional distress. The plaintiffs argued for extension of nuisance law, suggesting that the constant, unavoidable presence of what they saw as threatening imagery infringed upon their right to peacefully enjoy their own home. The defense, of course, championed artistic freedom and the right to decorate one's own yard without conforming to a neighbor's aesthetic preferences. This wasn't just about statues, it was a fight over whose sensibilities held legal weight. Could a court actually mandate that a property be visually pleasing to those who view it? The case delved into zoning ordinances and homeowners association rules, but ultimately it hinged on the intent behind the installation and the reasonableness of the offense. It revealed how our homes are not just private sanctuaries, but also part of a shared visual landscape, and that one person's artistic expression can very easily become another's daily nightmare. If you thought gargoyles staring into your window were bad, wait until you hear about the view that vanished and the tree that started a war. In a quiet, scenic community in Washington state, where homes were built to capitalize on breathtaking vistas of the surrounding mountains, a single Douglas fir sapling became the center of an international incident. It began simply enough. One homeowner, feeling a bit too exposed to their neighbor's second-story windows, decided to plant a new tree along the edge of their property. They claimed it was a matter of basic privacy, a natural barrier to shield their backyard from prying eyes. But for the neighbor directly behind them, this was no innocent act of gardening. From their perspective, this sapling was planted with malicious precision, positioned in the one exact spot that would, in a few years' time, grow to completely obliterate their home's main selling point, a panoramic, picture-perfect view of the Cascade Mountains. They argued this wasn't about privacy at all, but a deliberate act of view-blocking sabotage, a quiet revenge plotted with leaves and bark. What followed was a rapid escalation that turned a suburban yard into a scene from a spy thriller. It started with passive-aggressive notes, then evolved into clandestine nighttime operations. The view-obsessed neighbor was accused of trespassing to secretly trim branches that were just starting to encroach on their sightline. The tree planter retaliated with their own accusation, alleging that their neighbor was not watering the tree under the cover of darkness, but rather poisoning it with a harmful mixture designed to stunt its growth or kill it outright. The trust between these two households evaporated completely, replaced by a fog of paranoia and suspicion. That's when the cameras came out. To protect their investment and gather evidence, the homeowner who planted the tree installed a high-tech surveillance system. But the lenses weren't pointed at their doors or windows. They were trained directly on the fir tree itself, monitoring it 24/7 for any sign of tampering. Local news outlets caught wind of the story and dubbed the ever-watched sapling the spy tree, a title that perfectly captured the absurdity of the situation. This was no longer a disagreement over landscaping. It was a full-scale surveillance operation centered on a plant. The case forced the local authorities to weigh in on the murky legalities of a spite tree, questioning whether the intent behind planting something on your own property could ever be regulated, and where one person's right to privacy ends and another's right to a view begins. From manicured views and spiteful statues, we now journey to a sun-drenched neighborhood in California where a different kind of green-eyed monster was let loose, literally. This feud pitted one neighbor's obsessive pride in their lawn against another's creative and decidedly farm-based solution for retaliation. On one side of the fence was a homeowner whose grass was less a lawn and more a monument to perfection. This wasn't just green turf, it was a carpet of emerald blades, trimmed with surgical precision, free of a single dandelion, and consistently awarded the coveted Yard of the Month plaque by the local homeowners association. It was a source of immense pride and, frankly, a source of immense annoyance for the neighbor living next door. Feeling constantly overshadowed by this pristine, award-winning landscape, the neighboring homeowner decided to wage a biological war. They went out and acquired a small herd of pygmy goats, charming animals known for their voracious appetites and their distinctive aroma. The goats weren't just pets, they were strategic assets. Their new owner would carefully let them graze right along the property line, allowing their hungry little mouths to nibble away at the edges of that perfect lawn. The result was almost immediate. Neatly trimmed edges gave way to ragged, chewed-up patches of dirt. The constant bleating of the goats provided a new, rustic soundtrack to the neighborhood, and the pungent, barnyard smell began to waft over the award-winning flower beds. The legal battle that erupted was as absurd as it was complex. It quickly moved beyond simple property damage claims and dove headfirst into the bizarre world of municipal zoning. The lawn enthusiast argued the goats were a clear violation of city codes that prohibited livestock within residential limits, labeling them a public nuisance due to the noise and odor. The goat owner, however, mounted a clever defense. They argued that the pygmy goats were not livestock at all, but were instead emotional support animals, beloved pets that just happened to have a side gig in landscape management. This forced the city council and local courts to wrestle with definitions they never anticipated needing. What exactly is the legal difference between a pet and a farm animal? Does a goat's purpose change its classification? Can a quiet suburban street be suddenly rezoned by default because of a few hungry ruminants? This case became a landmark debate over the slow creep of rural life into urban spaces and how far property rights extend when your chosen form of expression has hooves and a digestive system. But for every dispute fought over something planted or built, there are others that take flight on wings and feathers, proving that sometimes our most contentious neighbors aren't people at all. In an exclusive, gated community nestled in the hills of California, a different kind of resident ruled the roost, a vibrant, strutting flock of peacocks. Their owner, a longtime resident, adored these birds, viewing their magnificent iridescent plumage and proud displays as living works of art that elevated the entire neighborhood's ambience. To him, their piercing, cacophonous cries were not noise, but the sound of nature's grandeur. For many of his sleep-deprived and frustrated neighbors, however, this was a nightmare scenario. They described being jolted awake before dawn by the ear-splitting screams of the birds, which some compared to the sound of a woman shrieking in distress. The problem was compounded by the peacock's free-range lifestyle. They considered the entire neighborhood their personal domain, pecking at expensive landscaping, leaving droppings on meticulously detailed luxury cars, and scratching the paint on freshly sealed driveways. The community splintered into two fiercely opposed camps: the pro-peacock brigade, who saw the birds as charming local celebrities, and the anti-peacock faction, who demanded their removal on grounds of noise, pollution, property damage, and public health. This feathered feud escalated all the way to city council meetings, where wealthy homeowners in designer clothes passionately debated avian law and the definition of a nuisance. It was a classic culture clash, pitting a landowner's right to keep exotic pets against a community's right to peace and quiet. The situation grew so tense that some residents were accused of taking matters into their own hands, with whispers of attempts to harm or relocate the birds illegally, transforming a sunny paradise into a scene of ornithological intrigue. Meanwhile, a similar battle was unfolding under the Texas sun, though this one was decidedly less glamorous and more clucky. a family inspired by the urban homesteading movement decided to build a modest chicken coop in their suburban backyard. Their goal was simple: a sustainable source of fresh eggs and a wholesome project for their children. They saw their handful of hens as pets with benefits, peaceful creatures whose gentle clucking was a soothing background noise. Their neighbors, however, perceived the coop as a smelly, noisy magnet for trouble. Complaints poured in about the faint but persistent odor of manure carried on the breeze, the early morning squawking that disturbed light sleepers, and most dramatically, the fear that the chickens would attract predators like raccoons, foxes, or even coyotes into the tightly packed subdivision. The conflict became a legal tug-of-war centered on the fine print of the community's homeowners association covenants. The family argued they were embracing self-sufficiency and healthy living, while the HOA pointed to strict rules prohibiting livestock and mandating uniformity. This wasn't just about a few chickens. It was a proxy war over the very soul of modern suburban life. It forced a conversation about where we draw the line between a productive homestead and a disruptive nuisance, and whether the idealized version of rural living can ever peacefully coexist with the manicured, controlled expectations of a suburban planned community. Both the peacock predicament and the chicken coop crisis highlight a growing tension as more people seek a connection to nature and a simpler way of life, often within neighborhoods that were specifically designed to keep that very chaos at bay. Of course, the escalation from biological warfare with goats and legal battles over peacocks brings us to a conflict that swapped feathers and foliage for cold, hard steel. This next dispute proves that sometimes the most cutting arguments aren't shouted over a fence, but are instead silently erected in plain sight. In a quiet Minnesota suburb where driveways typically blur together into a seamless ribbon of concrete, a war broke out over a matter of mere inches. It began with the most common of suburban annoyances: a neighbor's car parked just a little too close to the property line, its tires occasionally drifting a few precious inches over the invisible boundary. For most people, this might warrant a polite conversation or, at worst, a mildly annoyed sigh. But for one homeowner, this minor transgression was an intolerable invasion, a repeated act of territorial disrespect that demanded a permanent and unmistakable response. So they decided to draw a line in the concrete, literally. They hired a contractor to install a row of dozens of thin, sharp-edged metal rods, each hammered deep into the ground along the very edge of their driveway. The rods were spaced with meticulous, almost obsessive precision, set exactly a car wheel's width apart from one another. This created a formidable, spine-like barrier that made it physically impossible for any part of a neighboring vehicle to cross onto their side. What had been an invisible property line was now a stark, metallic fence that transformed the entire curb appeal of the two homes. The anti-parking barrier was an instant local landmark, a bizarre monument to pettiness that drew curious glances from passersby and became the talk of the neighborhood. It was a statement so passive-aggressive it was practically shouting, a solution that was both incredibly effective and utterly absurd. The neighbor whose parking habits had sparked the installation was, understandably, furious. They argued that the jagged row of metal rods was not only an eyesore that devalued both properties, but also a potential safety hazard, a dangerous obstacle for children playing, cyclists, or anyone walking along the driveway at night. This forced the local municipal government to step into a debate they likely never imagined having. The case hinged on a strange intersection of property rights and municipal codes. Was this structure a legitimate boundary marker, a simple extension of the homeowner's right to define their property, or was it an unpermitted, hazardous fence that violated local ordinances governing the height and type of structures allowed at the property line? The court had to ponder questions about the nature of a fence itself. If its primary purpose wasn't for privacy or security but for spite, did that change its legal standing? This driveway divider debacle became a stark lesson in how the quest for absolute control over a few inches of space can lead to an outcome that makes everyone a little less happy, proving that the most rigid solutions often create the most lasting resentments. Yet for every dispute fought with metal or livestock, there are those waged in the name of art itself, where the battlefield is aesthetics and the weapons are creativity and zoning ordinances. This brings us to a quiet street in upstate New York, where a homeowner with a fiercely artistic vision decided their front lawn was not merely grass to be mowed, but a blank canvas waiting for a grand, provocative statement. Rejecting the conventional shrub and mulch landscape of their neighbors, they embarked on an ambitious project, transforming their property into a sprawling, ever-evolving sculpture garden of truly avant-garde proportions. This wasn't a collection of tasteful bronze figures. This was a labyrinthine assemblage crafted from the discarded and the found, old washing machines painted in neon hues, towers of carefully stacked tires acting as plinths for weathered typewriters, a fleet of child's bicycles welded together into a sprawling metallic beast, and hundreds of painted rocks arranged in swirling, cryptic patterns that some argued were messages only the artist understood. To the creator, this was a profound commentary on consumerism and rebirth, a vibrant, open-air gallery that challenged the sterile conformity of suburban life. It was their First Amendment right made manifest in chrome and spray paint. Their neighbors, however, saw a very different picture. To them, this wasn't a gallery, it was a public nuisance and a slowly metastasizing junkyard. They complained the installation was a blatant eyesore that was actively dragging down the entire neighborhood's property values, arguing that no prospective buyer would want to live next door to what looked like a recycling center's chaotic overflow. The situation escalated from muttered complaints over hedges to formal calls to the city's code enforcement office, citing violations against the storage of unregistered vehicles and unpermitted outdoor structures. What followed was a classic culture clash fought in the bland meeting rooms of municipal buildings. On one side stood the artist and their supporters, a passionate group of local art students and free expression advocates who organized protests with signs that read, "Censorship has no home here," and "Defend the vision." They framed the issue as a battle for the soul of the community, pitting boring conformity against bold, transformative art. Arrayed against them were the neighbors and the city officials, armed with thick binders of property maintenance codes and zoning regulations designed to preserve what they termed community character. The legal arguments were fascinatingly complex, forcing a small-town court to wrestle with questions usually reserved for big city art critics. Where is the line between a sculpture and junk? Can a city legally dictate what is considered art on private property? Does a homeowner's right to creative expression outweigh a neighbor's right to a certain aesthetic standard and property value? This dispute became a microcosm of a much larger, ongoing national conversation about art, public space, and the sometimes uncomfortable friction between individual liberty and the collective good, proving that one person's masterpiece can indeed be another's nightmare. But perhaps no dispute better captures the modern, technological twist on neighborly conflict than the case of the invisible fence fiasco in Illinois. This wasn't a battle over something you could see or touch, like a gargoyle or a flagpole, but a war over an unseen, silent boundary that only made its presence known through a painful jolt. It began when one homeowner, seeking a convenient way to keep their beloved dog safely contained within their yard, invested in a popular electronic invisible fence system. They buried a thin wire around the perimeter of their property and outfitted their dog with a special collar that would deliver a sharp, corrective static shock whenever it approached the boundary line. To them, it was a modern marvel of pet ownership, a way to give their dog freedom without the eyesore of a physical fence. For their neighbor, however, whose own friendly and somewhat wandering cat frequently roamed the yards, it became a terrifying hazard. The cat, lacking any warning collar of its own, would inadvertently cross the buried wire and receive the full, startling shock meant for a much larger animal. The cat's owner was horrified, describing how their pet would yowl in pain and scramble back home, eventually becoming too fearful to even go outside. They argued that their neighbor had effectively booby-trapped the entire property line, creating an invisible field of punishment that their own innocent animal couldn't possibly detect or understand. What started as a heated conversation about pet safety quickly escalated into a profound legal debate over liability and intent. The cat's owner accused their neighbor of intentionally laying a trap, arguing that by creating an unseen danger that could only be perceived by one specific animal, they had created an attractive nuisance and a reckless endangerment to other pets. The dog's owner fired back, asserting their right to secure their own property in a legal, non-intrusive way and placing the blame squarely on the neighbor for allowing their cat to roam unsupervised onto private land. The lawsuit that followed forced the courts to grapple with bizarre, almost philosophical questions about property lines in the digital age. Can you be held responsible for an injury caused by a boundary that doesn't physically exist? Does the installation of such a system require a duty to warn neighbors of its presence? The case hinged on the very definition of a fence itself. Was this electronic barrier a reasonable, modern equivalent to a picket fence, or was it something entirely new and unregulated, a form of technological aggression that fundamentally changed the nature of the shared space between homes? This dispute proved that in our increasingly wired world, even the most well-intentioned solutions can create shocking new frontiers for conflict. Just when you thought the boundaries of neighborly conflict couldn't get any weirder, technology stepped in to create entirely new frontiers for feuding. We've moved from goats and gargoyles into the digital age, where arguments aren't just about what you can see, but about invisible signals and stolen sunlight. Our next two disputes prove that even our most modern solutions can become our newest battlegrounds. First, we head to the sun-scorched suburbs of Arizona, where a simple quest for better television reception spiraled into a paranoid Cold War. One homeowner, frustrated with spotty cable service, decided to take matters into their own hands by installing a massive satellite dish in their backyard. This wasn't one of the small, modern domes you see today. This was a colossal, parabolic antenna, several feet across, pointed skyward to catch signals from the heavens. They positioned it for the perfect angle to get every sports channel and movie package imaginable. The problem was, its unwavering gaze wasn't just fixed on a satellite. From the perspective of the neighbor directly behind them, the gigantic dish was aimed like a giant, metallic eye directly into their master bedroom window. This sparked an immediate and intense panic. The neighbor began researching online, falling down internet rabbit holes filled with speculation about low-level radiation emission, potential health risks, and fears of unintended surveillance. They became convinced the device was not just an eyesore, but a hazard, bombarding their home with invisible energy waves and perhaps even inadvertently capturing their private moments. The complaints began rolling in, citing everything from unexplained headaches to a deep-seated feeling of being watched in their own home. The resulting argument was a bizarre clash of technophobia and property rights. The dish owner argued they were simply using their property to access a legal service and that any radiation fears were based on junk science and paranoia. The concerned neighbor, armed with printouts from dubious websites, demanded the dish be moved or shielded, turning a simple utility installation into a high-stakes debate over the right to feel safe from perceived technological threats. It was a perfect modern dilemma, proving that in an age of invisible signals, even a neighbor's convenience can be interpreted as a personal invasion. Meanwhile, in the clear, high-altitude sunshine of Colorado, a different technological conflict was brewing. One fought not over invisible waves, but over the most fundamental energy source of all, sunlight itself. A homeowner, motivated by environmental ideals and long-term savings, made a significant investment in a full rooftop array of solar panels. They carefully calculated the sun's path, positioned the panels for maximum exposure, and looked forward to generating their own clean power. Their plans were literally overshadowed when their next-door neighbor, seeking more space, began construction on a dramatic second-story addition. The new structure rose high above the property line, and as the walls went up, a long, cold shadow began to creep across the solar panels for several critical hours each day. The effect was devastating. The system's energy output plummeted, turning a promising investment into a financial albatross. The solar panel owner was furious, arguing that their neighbor's renovation had effectively stolen their access to the sun, a resource they had come to depend on. This launched a fierce legal battle that pushed into the relatively new and complex area of solar access rights. The concept, known legally as a solar easement, is a right to receive sunlight across someone else's property, and it's recognized in some form by many states. The case became a landmark debate in the neighborhood, forcing local officials to grapple with questions about property growth and renewable energy. Does one homeowner's right to expand their property outweigh their neighbor's right to the renewable energy they've already invested in? The solar homeowner argued that the shadow was an active deprivation of a resource, while the neighbor building the addition countered that they had every right to build upward on their own land. This dispute highlights the growing pains of modern living, where the age-old right to build on your property can now directly conflict with a newer, emerging right to harvest the sun. While high-tech signals and solar rays created modern dilemmas, nothing prepared a quiet Pennsylvania cul-de-sac for the all-out sensory assault that would become known as the holiday lights hostilities. It began, as so many neighborhood wars do, with the best of intentions. One family, renowned for their love of Christmas, decided to transform their humble home into a beacon of festive joy. They invested thousands of dollars in a staggering array of lights, inflatables, and animated figures. But this was no simple string of bulbs. It was a choreographed spectacular. A complex network of controllers synchronized tens of thousands of flashing lights to a booming soundtrack of holiday classics, broadcast to the entire street through a powerful outdoor speaker system. What the family saw as a gift to the community, their neighbors quickly came to view as an occupation. The display was so massive and popular that it drew traffic from across the region. Cars would line up for blocks, idling for hours as families waited for a chance to witness the spectacle. The constant stream of visitors created a perpetual traffic jam on their once quiet street, making it nearly impossible for residents to enter or leave their own driveways. The thunderous bass lines of Jingle Bell Rock and Carol of the Bells didn't stop at sundown. They echoed through the neighborhood until late into the night, vibrating through walls and disrupting sleep cycles. The blinding, strobing lights turned the night into day, casting a relentless, pulsating glow into every nearby bedroom. After enduring a second consecutive season of this, a coalition of exhausted neighbors decided they had endured enough festive tyranny. They banded together and filed a lawsuit, arguing that their right to peaceful enjoyment of their own homes had been completely extinguished for 2 months of the year. The case that landed in the local court was a true legal holiday paradox, pitting the cherished American ideal of festive expression against the fundamental need for residential peace. The family behind the display mounted a passionate First Amendment defense, framing their creation as a form of protected speech, a joyful, temporary art installation that celebrated a national holiday. The neighbors' attorneys, however, argued that no right is absolute and that the scale of the disruption transformed a personal celebration into a public nuisance of the highest order. The court was forced to become the ultimate Grinch, weighing the decibel levels of Mariah Carey against the right to a full night's sleep, the legality of traffic jams caused by Santa's sleigh against the right to access one's own property. The judge's eventual ruling attempted to find a Solomonic compromise, imposing strict time limits on the music and requiring the family to hire off-duty police officers to manage the disruptive traffic flow. The verdict left no one truly happy, transforming what was once a source of joy into a bitter, multi-year grudge that ensured Christmas on that street would forever be accompanied by a side of cold, simmering resentment. But for all the high-tech surveillance and holiday havoc, sometimes the most maddening disputes boil down to the relentless, primal rhythm of a simple game. In a serene Connecticut suburb where the soundtrack was typically the hum of lawnmowers and the distant chirping of birds, a new, persistent beat began to dominate, the steady, unnerving thump, thump, thump of a basketball pounding against a driveway at all hours of the day and night. The source was a standard, affordable basketball hoop installed at the end of a neighbor's driveway, a commonplace feature of American childhood. For the family that put it up, it was a source of healthy recreation for their teenagers, a way to keep them active and entertained close to home. For the neighbor whose property line ran mere feet from the base of the hoop, however, this was an unending auditory assault. They described the noise as a form of psychological torture, a rhythmic, percussive intrusion that vibrated through their walls, interrupted phone calls, made concentration impossible, and shattered any hope of a peaceful evening on their patio. The repetitive sound would start after school, continue through dinner, and often persist late into the evening, its echoes feeling amplified in the quiet of the night. Repeated polite requests to limit play to daylight hours were met with shrugs and empty promises, the classic standoff between a parent's desire for their kids to have fun and a neighbor's right to domestic tranquility. Frustration festered into a quiet, seething rage. The aggrieved neighbor, feeling utterly unheard and powerless, decided that if civil discourse had failed, more direct action was required. One evening, after the last dribble had finally ceased, they allegedly crept over the property line with a simple tool, a wrench. In an act of calculated vandalism, they proceeded to carefully loosen the critical bolts securing the massive plastic base of the hoop, filled with hundreds of gallons of water for stability. They didn't destroy it outright, they sabotaged its structural integrity, turning a stable sports fixture into a precarious accident waiting to happen. The inevitable collapse came the next afternoon during a spirited game. As a player went up for a layup, grabbing the rim, the entire structure teetered and then crashed violently to the pavement, narrowly missing the children and scattering the basketball across the lawn. What had been a war of noise complaints instantly escalated into a matter for the police. The basketball hoop owners, furious and frightened by the clear intent to cause harm, filed a report for criminal mischief and trespassing. The accused neighbor, when confronted, denied everything, creating a bitter whodunit that split the neighborhood into factions. The investigation involved forensic checks for tool marks on the bolts and interviews with other residents, transforming a petty argument over nuisance into a serious legal case that explored the dangerous lengths to which people will go when they feel their peace has been stolen. Sometimes the most peaceful intentions can unleash the most aggressive consequences, a lesson learned the hard way in a serene Michigan subdivision. It started with a simple, almost universal desire, a little more privacy. One homeowner, tired of making small talk every time they stepped onto their back deck, sought a natural solution. They wanted a living screen, something lush and green that would grow quickly and shield them from the world. They settled on bamboo, attracted by its reputation for rapid growth and elegant, rustling stalks. They planted a row along their property line, envisioning a peaceful, Asian-inspired hedge that would bring tranquility and seclusion. What they failed to realize, a critical oversight with devastating repercussions, is that the particular variety they chose was running bamboo, a botanical term that sounds gentle but describes one of the most invasively aggressive plants on the planet. Unlike the more docile clumping varieties, running bamboo doesn't just grow up. It wages a silent, relentless underground war. Its root system, a network of tough, spear-like stems called rhizomes, doesn't respect survey lines or property deeds. These rhizomes can tunnel through soil at an astonishing rate, sometimes growing more than 20 feet in a single season, traveling deep underground until they find a weak point to surface. And surface they did. The first sign of trouble for the neighbor was a single, defiant green shoot that pushed up through a crack in their perfectly laid brick patio. Then another appeared in the middle of a prized rose bed. Within months, their manicured lawn was punctured by a strange, alien army of sharp shoots erupting everywhere. The bamboo's underground network was on a destructive rampage. The delicate root systems of existing trees and shrubs were choked out. The rhizomes, seeking moisture and expansion, began to press against the very foundation of the neighbor's home, threatening to seek out minuscule cracks and exploit them, potentially causing catastrophic structural damage over time. Their beautiful yard was being systematically dismantled from below. The conflict that erupted was as deep-rooted as the bamboo itself. It was no longer a simple neighbor-to-neighbor complaint. It was a full-scale environmental containment operation. The offended neighbor demanded not just that the bamboo be removed from their property, but that the source be completely and permanently eradicated. This is where the true nightmare began. Eradicating a mature running bamboo infestation is a Herculean task. You cannot simply cut it down. The entire network of rhizomes must be dug out, a process that often requires industrial excavators to tear up entire sections of both yards, destroying landscaping, sprinkler systems, and patios in the process. Alternatively, it requires the installation of immensely expensive, specialized underground rhizome barriers, dug several feet deep around the entire perimeter of the infestation, a project that can cost tens of thousands of dollars. The ensuing lawsuit was a bitter fight over horticultural responsibility and financial burden. The bamboo planter argued they had no malicious intent and couldn't be held fully liable for a plant's natural growth patterns. The neighbor, facing a staggering bill for excavation and repairs, argued that ignorance was no excuse for the damage caused. The case became a landmark dispute in the community, even prompting local lawmakers to consider ordinances specifically banning the planting of running bamboo, turning a private feud into a public warning about the unintended consequences of our choices in the garden. Even the most tightly packed urban environments offer no refuge from the gravitational pull of pettiness, as proven by a clash in a dense Chicago neighborhood where the very air between two buildings became a weapon. The combatants were two neighbors living in directly adjacent high-rises, their windows separated by a narrow alley so slim they could practically see the titles on each other's bookshelves. The conflict ignited not with a shout, but with a silent, searing beam of light. One resident, seeking relief from the oppressive summer sun and hoping to slash their air conditioning bill, made a practical upgrade. They installed a high-tech, metallic window film designed to reflect solar heat. To them, it was a simple act of energy efficiency. For the neighbor directly across the way, however, this modern convenience was anything but simple. The film was exceptionally reflective, acting less like a coating and more like a polished mirror. Each afternoon, as the sun traced its path across the sky, it reached a precise angle where it would strike this treated window and transform it into a concentrated weapon. A blinding, laser-like shaft of light would pour through the glass, projecting a brilliant, shimmering rectangle that swept across the opposing apartment. It would ignite dust motes in the air, bleach the color from furniture, and create a spot of intense heat so unbearable it made entire rooms uninhabitable for hours. What was meant to block heat had become a magnifying glass focused by one home onto the heart of another. After enduring weeks of what they described as a daily solar assault, the recipient of the glare decided to fight fire with fire, or more accurately, light with light. Refusing to engage in a verbal confrontation, they opted for a response rooted in pure, elegant physics. They went out and purchased the largest mirror they could find, a massive, wall-mounted sheet of glass, and installed it with meticulous care on their own wall, angled with the precision of a satellite dish. Their goal was not to block the light, but to send it back from whence it came. The retaliatory beam was now redirected, bouncing across the alley and striking the original installer's apartment with a vengeance. The silent war of reflections had officially begun. This tit-for-tat escalation created a bizarre and hazardous phenomenon. The narrow alley between the buildings became a canyon of bouncing photons, a dangerous and dazzling light show that would erupt every sunny afternoon. The concentrated beams would sometimes stray, flashing into other apartments, temporarily blinding drivers on the street below, and even posing a potential fire risk as the intense spots of heat landed on curtains or papers. The situation grew so out of hand that other tenants in both buildings banded together to file complaints, forcing the city's Department of Buildings to intervene. Inspectors were left scratching their heads, confronted with a nuisance complaint that fell into a gray area of the municipal code. There were no ordinances specifically governing reflected sunlight between private properties. The case became a debate over the legal definition of a nuisance in the age of advanced materials. questioning whether a homeowner's right to energy efficiency could be curtailed if it functionally weaponized the sun against their neighbor. This window war proved that even our attempts to improve our own living space can inadvertently turn the most fundamental natural resource into a tool for conflict. Of course, even in the most scenic and pastoral settings, a conflict can erupt that assaults not the eyes or the ears, but the most primal of our senses, smell. No amount of legal wrangling or technological intervention can easily contain an odor, as two communities discovered when the very air they breathed became a toxic battleground. Our first olfactory offense takes us to the green, environmentally conscious hills of Vermont, where one homeowner's dedication to sustainable living spiraled into a community health crisis. This individual, a passionate advocate for reducing waste, decided to go far beyond a simple countertop compost bin. They embarked on a large-scale composting operation right in their backyard, amassing a massive, open-air pile of food scraps, yard waste, and other organic materials. In their mind, this was a noble endeavor, a way to give back to the earth and create rich soil for a future garden. For the neighbors living downwind, however, this well-intentioned project was an unmitigated disaster. The pile, rarely turned properly to accelerate decomposition and avoid anaerobic processes, began to ferment. It emitted a pervasive, sickly, sweet stench of rot that hung over the entire block like a foul cloud, making it impossible to enjoy a meal on the deck, host a barbecue, or even keep windows open on a warm day. The situation went from unpleasant to outright hazardous when the decomposing buffet began to attract a thriving population of rats, which then began to migrate from the compost pile into nearby garages, sheds, and even basements. The neighbors weren't just complaining about a bad smell, they were documenting property damage and fearing for public health. The ensuing dispute was a classic clash of values. The composter argued they were practicing a form of environmental stewardship, protected by their right to manage their property as they saw fit, framing the complaints as an attack on eco-friendly values. The neighbors, armed with testimonials from pest control experts and logs of the unbearable odor, argued that the scale of the operation had transformed a private choice into a public nuisance. The local health department was forced to step in, issuing violation notices and sparking a complex debate about where personal sustainability ends and community well-being begins. It was a painful lesson that even the greenest of ideals can curdle under the wrong conditions. Meanwhile, a far more ancient agricultural aroma was causing a very different kind of uproar in rural Indiana. Here, the conflict wasn't between two individual homeowners, but between two entirely different ways of life that had suddenly been forced into close proximity. For generations, a local farmer had practiced the age-old tradition of spreading liquid manure from his livestock operations onto his fields as a natural, nutrient-rich fertilizer. It was a routine part of his agricultural cycle, a smell he and his fellow farmers simply accepted as the price of putting food on the table. The problem arose when a new, sprawling suburban-style subdivision was built right on the edge of his property line. The new residents, attracted by the pastoral views and the quiet country life, were utterly unprepared for the reality of that life. One spring day, as the farmer began his customary spreading, a powerful, eye-watering odor, the unmistakable, pungent scent of liquefied manure wafted on the breeze and settled directly over the pristine new homes. With their windows open to enjoy the fresh air, residents found their houses suddenly filled with an overwhelming stench that clung to curtains, furniture, and clothing. The new subdivision erupted in outrage, flooding the county commissioner's office with complaints and demanding the farmer be stopped. The farmer, bewildered and insulted, stood his ground. He argued that his family had been farming that land long before the subdivision's foundations were ever poured, and that his practices were not only legal but essential to his livelihood. He accused the new neighbors of trying to force their suburban sensibilities onto a working agricultural landscape they clearly didn't understand. This confrontation became a symbolic battle over the very soul of the American landscape. It pitted a farmer's right to farm, protected by long-standing state laws designed to shield agriculture from nuisance lawsuits brought by encroaching development against the right of new homeowners to what they deemed a basic level of habitable air quality. The courts were asked to decide a seemingly impossible question: who has a greater right to the airspace over a community, the person who has worked the land for decades, or the people who just moved in next door? This manure misunderstanding highlighted the growing and often smelly tension as suburban expansion continues to bump up against rural traditions, proving that sometimes you can't escape the facts of life. But for every silent light war and every malodorous agricultural standoff, there are disputes rooted in something far more fundamental: a philosophical battle over the very definition of a lawn itself. This brings us to a classic suburban street in Wisconsin where a simple, ecologically minded decision blossomed into a full-scale turf war. One spring, a homeowner, inspired by the growing No Mow May movement, decided to participate. The concept was simple and noble. By letting your lawn grow undisturbed throughout the month of May, you provide crucial early season habitat and food sources for struggling pollinators like bees and butterflies. So they turned off their mower and watched with satisfaction as their yard transformed. Lush clover spread its leaves, vibrant yellow dandelions bloomed like tiny suns, and a variety of native grasses and wildflowers began to peek through, creating a miniature, buzzing meadow. To the neighbor living directly next door, a man for whom a perfectly manicured lawn was a non-negotiable symbol of order, discipline, and civic pride, this wasn't a meadow, it was a horrifying blight. His own yard was a flawless emerald green carpet, a monoculture maintained with a strict regimen of watering, chemical fertilizers, and weekly mowing to a precise, golf course-grade height. The untamed jungle next door, in his view, was an affront to the entire neighborhood's aesthetic. It was a public declaration of sloth, an invitation for weeds to seed and spread onto his pristine turf, and a haven for ticks and other pests. He saw not a sanctuary for bees, but a festering problem. The conflict began with a series of anonymously left, increasingly nasty notes slipped into the eco-conscious homeowner's mailbox, decrying the eyesore and warning of plummeting property values. When these were ignored, the situation escalated under the cover of darkness. One night, the pollinator advocate woke to the distant, familiar rumble of a lawnmower. Peering out their window, they were met with an unbelievable sight. Their neighbor, illuminated by a single spotlight attached to his riding mower, was methodically cutting down the entire No Mow May sanctuary. He was trespassing, driving back and forth across their property, systematically decimating the clover and dandelions in a midnight raid. The confrontation that followed was anything but quiet. It was a shouting match that echoed through the sleeping street, a profound clash of ideologies fought over chopped-up grass clippings. The no-mow homeowner was furious about the blatant trespass and destruction of their deliberate environmental project. The mowing neighbor was defiant, arguing he was performing a civic duty, protecting the neighborhood from what he perceived as a neglectful nuisance. The police were called not to settle the gardening debate, but to address the clear criminal act of trespassing and property damage. This dispute became a microcosm of a much larger national conversation happening in suburbs everywhere. It pitted a new, environmentally conscious ethos that seeks to rewield our personal spaces against a deeply ingrained, post-war American ideal of the lawn as a symbol of control over nature and conformity to community standards. The legal outcome may have hinged on the trespassing charge, but the emotional heart of the conflict was about something much deeper: whether a perfectly manicured lawn is a virtue or an ecological vice, and who truly gets to decide what nature should look like in our own backyards. Yet after all the battles over basketballs and bamboo, it feels almost mundane to imagine that a simple choice of color could spark a war. But that's precisely what happened in a sun-baked Nevada suburb, where a sudden and violent desert storm ripped a long-standing shared fence right out of the ground. What should have been a straightforward repair project between two neighbors quickly curdled into a bitter stalemate, rooted in two completely opposing visions of suburban beauty. With the property line now naked and exposed, every backyard barbecue, every letting the dog out, every moment of private relaxation felt like a public performance, fueling a desperate need to rebuild the barrier. Yet they couldn't agree on the most fundamental aspect, what the new fence should look like. For one neighbor, the answer was simple, clean, and classic: a bright, uniform white. They argued that white was the standard for the neighborhood. It looked crisp and well-maintained, and it would reflect the harsh desert sun, helping to keep both yards slightly cooler. For the other neighbor, this was an appalling suggestion. They saw a white fence as cheap, artificial, and glaringly out of place against the natural, earthy tones of the desert landscape. Their unwavering demand was for a natural cedar finish, valuing its warm, rustic hue that would weather gracefully to a soft silver gray, blending into the environment rather than fighting against it. Months slid by. The pile of broken fence posts and splintered pickets was eventually hauled away, leaving only a scar of empty post holes marching along the property line. In its place grew a different, invisible fence, one built from cold shoulders, muttered complaints, and a series of terse, failed negotiations conducted over the actual property line. The dispute became a daily irritation, a constant reminder of their inability to find common ground on something that seemed, to any outside observer, incredibly simple. The inability to resolve it festered, transforming a simple aesthetic preference into a symbol of disrespect and stubbornness. With no progress made, the matter finally landed in the most absurd of arenas, small claims court. The two neighbors found themselves standing before a judge, not arguing over damages or loud noises, but pleading their cases for and against specific shades of brown and white. The courtroom, accustomed to cases of unpaid debts and minor property damage, became a forum for a passionate debate on suburban aesthetics, property values, and the very definition of neutral. Each party presented their case with the gravity of a Supreme Court litigator, one holding up swatches of white paint to demonstrate its brightness and cleanliness, the other presenting samples of cedar to showcase its natural, organic warmth. The judge was left with a uniquely ridiculous task to legally determine the most acceptable hue for a backyard fence. The ruling couldn't possibly please everyone, and it didn't. By mandating one color over the other, the court handed one neighbor a victory and the other a bitter defeat, ensuring that every time the loser looked at that newly constructed fence, they wouldn't see a boundary marker. They would see a monument to a lost argument, a permanent, daily reminder of a conflict that a little compromise could have easily solved. And just when you think you've heard it all, a dispute emerges that proves even the most universal symbol of backyard bliss, the swimming pool, can become a shimmering vortex of conflict. This particular clash unfolded under the blistering Arizona sun, where one family's dream of a personal oasis quickly became their neighbor's waking nightmare. They'd invested in a stunning new swimming pool, a gorgeous turquoise haven complete with a spacious deck, perfect for beating the heat and hosting summer gatherings. To them, it was the ultimate upgrade, a centerpiece for family fun, and a surefire way to increase their property's value. For the homeowner living next door, however, the construction project quickly revealed a serious oversight. The pool's expansive deck had been built flush against the shared property line, eliminating any buffer zone and placing the epicenter of the family's aquatic activities just a few feet from their own back windows. The complaints started with the expected issues: the loud, repetitive splashing that echoed late into the evening, the boisterous noise from weekend pool parties that disrupted the neighborhood's quiet, and the perceived invasion of privacy as wet, laughing children were now playing practically within arm's reach of their patio. But the most bizarre and debilitating grievance was one nobody saw coming. Due to the pool's placement and the intense desert sunlight, the surface of the water was acting like a giant, wobbly mirror. All day long, as the sun moved across the sky, it would catch the rippling water and project a chaotic, shimmering pattern of light reflections directly into the neighbor's home. They described it as a constant, disorienting strobe light effect that flickered across their television screen, danced on their walls, and created a dizzying, almost nauseating atmosphere in their own living room. It was an inescapable, silent assault that made it difficult to read, relax, or even concentrate. What followed was a legal argument that dove into the obscure realm of light trespass and reflective nuisances. The pool owners argued they had followed all proper permitting procedures and that the sounds of summer fun were a normal part of suburban life. Their frustrated neighbor, however, hired an expert who used specialized equipment to document the flicker frequency and intensity of the light reflections, arguing it constituted a private nuisance that made their home virtually uninhabitable during daylight hours. The case forced the local zoning board to consider questions they'd never before encountered. Does a property owner have a right to be free from reflected light? Can the simple act of sunlight bouncing off a legally built pool be considered a form of infringement? This dispute became a perfect storm of conflicting rights, pitting one family's desire for recreational enjoyment against another's fundamental right to peace and quiet within their own four walls, all mediated by the unpredictable interplay of light and water. It served as a costly lesson in the importance of considering not just what you build, but how its presence will ripple out and affect the world and the sunlight of those living right beside you. While pools and fences create tangible nuisances, our next dispute proves that sometimes the most disruptive invasion isn't about property or privacy, but about the very purpose of a neighborhood itself. In a serene, tree-lined Georgia community where the rhythm of life was set by school buses and weekend lawn mowing, one homeowner spotted an opportunity and turned their residence into a bustling hub of commerce. They launched a dog walking and boarding business, capitalizing on the area's many dual-income families who needed care for their pets. What began as a modest side hustle quickly exploded into a lucrative enterprise, with the homeowner sometimes hosting over a dozen dogs at once in their backyard and basement turned kennel. To the entrepreneur, this was the very picture of the American dream, a clever use of their property to build a successful business from the ground up. They saw happy pets and grateful owners and the cheerful jingle of the cash register. For the family living next door, however, it was a waking nightmare that transformed their quiet street into a chaotic commercial district. Their once peaceful mornings were now punctuated by a constant stream of strangers in cars, pulling in and out at all hours to drop off or pick up their pets. The comings and goings created a near-constant traffic jam in the cul-de-sac, making it difficult to back out of their own driveway and shattering any sense of security. Then there was the noise, a perpetual, chaotic chorus of barks, yips, and howls that emanated from the backyard at all hours, a stark contrast to the quiet hum of the suburb. The final straw came in the form of the occasional escapee. A frightened or overly curious dog would occasionally find a gap in the fence and bolt into the neighboring yards, digging up flower beds, startling children, and forcing frantic chases down the street. The aggrieved neighbor argued that this wasn't just a nuisance, it was a fundamental violation of the neighborhood's character. They contended that a zoned residential area was being illegally transformed into a commercial kennel, complete with all the noise, traffic, and disruption of a storefront, but without any of the regulations or oversight. The legal battle that erupted was a classic clash between entrepreneurial spirit and residential tranquility. The dog boarder argued they were providing a valuable service and operating legally out of their home, much like a freelance writer or a telecommuter. The neighbor, however, pressed the city to enforce strict zoning ordinances that typically prohibit high-traffic commercial operations in residential zones. The case forced local officials to define what constitutes a home business in the modern age. Is it a quiet, internet-based operation with no impact on neighbors, or can it include a venture that generates significant foot traffic, noise, and externalities? This dispute became a landmark debate over the creeping commercialization of residential life, questioning whether the right to earn a living at home ends where a neighbor's right to peaceful enjoyment begins. Backyard builders usually only have to worry about measuring twice and cutting once, but one father in Oregon found himself needing a different kind of measurement, a precise property survey. His vision was a grand, multi-level treehouse for his children, complete with a rope bridge and a lookout tower, all built into the sturdy branches of a magnificent, centuries-old oak. He poured his heart, his weekends, and a significant amount of money into the project, creating what any kid would consider a dream fortress in the sky. There was just one monumental oversight. In his excitement, he'd failed to confirm the exact location of the property line. A subsequent survey revealed the devastating truth: the massive trunk of the oak tree grew directly astride the boundary between his land and his neighbors. Even worse, the sprawling structure he'd built, with its platforms and bridges, extended a good several feet into the airspace above his neighbor's yard. What began as a project born of love instantly became a legal nightmare. The neighbor, upon making this discovery, was immediately alarmed. They weren't just being a killjoy, they raised two very serious and legally valid concerns. The first was straightforward trespass. The physical structure was quite literally invading their property, a clear violation of their rights. The second, and far more consequential, was the enormous issue of liability. If a child were to fall from the treehouse and get injured on their side of the property line, or if the structure itself were to collapse onto their shed or patio, they could be held financially responsible in a lawsuit, regardless of who built it. They politely but firmly demanded the entire treehouse be dismantled. The father, heartbroken and facing the prospect of destroying his children's beloved play space, dug in his heels and refused. He argued that the tree itself was a natural landmark that benefited both properties and that the treehouse caused no actual harm, merely occupying unused air. This stalemate ignited a legal battle that quickly moved beyond a simple property dispute and into the fascinating and rarely tested legal realm of air rights. The core question the courts had to answer was profound. How far do your property rights extend into the sky above your land? The principle, derived from ancient common law, is cuius isti solium, ius isti usque ad coelum et ad inferos. Whoever owns the soil owns up to the heavens and down to hell. While modern law and aviation regulations have obviously limited the up to the heavens part, the fundamental right to control the immediate airspace above your property is still very much recognized. The neighbor argued this principle was absolute. Any intrusion, whether by a drone, an overhanging roof, or a treehouse platform, was a violation. The treehouse owner, however, proposed a doctrine of reasonable use, suggesting that a minor, harmless intrusion into the airspace for something like a treehouse should be permitted, especially when the alternative was destroying a structure built around a shared natural resource. The case became a torturous exercise in legal balancing, weighing the treehouse owner's sentimental investment and his children's enjoyment against the neighbor's absolute right to exclude others from their property and their very real fear of legal liability. It was a conflict between two equally understandable human desires: the desire to create joy for one's family and the desire to be secure from risk and intrusion. The court's eventual decision would set a precedent not just for these two neighbors, but for anyone whose dream project might ever cast a shadow, however small, onto the land next door. Amidst the tranquil flower beds and perfectly trimmed hedges of an Ohio suburb, a very peculiar crime wave began to unfold, one that targeted the most innocent of lawn residents, garden gnomes. This wasn't a case of simple theft or wanton destruction. It was a campaign of psychological warfare waged with pointed whimsy. The owner of the gnomes, a serious-minded collector who took great pride in his orderly display of ceramic figures, would wake up repeatedly to find his cherished display had been altered overnight. His jovial gnome holding a fishing rod might be discovered with its pants pulled down around its ankles. The friendly fellow with a lantern would be found aiming a tiny spray-painted mustache and monocle at the house next door. On other occasions, entire gnomes would simply vanish, only to reappear days later, posed in a compromising tableau with a pink flamingo lawn ornament. Convinced the culprit could only be his sarcastic and frequently smirking neighbor, the gnome enthusiast began a meticulous counter-operation. He set up a motion-activated camera focused on his front yard, determined to catch the vandal in the act. For weeks, the footage revealed nothing but raccoons and the occasional wandering cat. The mysterious gnome nappings and artistic alterations continued unabated, fueling a deepening sense of paranoia and frustration. The situation escalated from silent suspicion to open hostility, with accusations shouted over the property line and passive-aggressive notes left in mailboxes. The victim began to document every single incident in a detailed log, complete with timestamps and photographs of the vandalized figures, which he began to refer to as his evidence file. The final straw came when his prized centerpiece, a large, expensive gnome modeled after a famous fantasy character, was discovered missing. In its place was a miniature ransom note, cut from magazine letters, demanding a truce in the form of a 6-pack of craft beer left on the porch. This theatrical touch was the last bit of proof he needed. He marched next door, logbook in hand, and a massive shouting match ensued, with the accused neighbor vehemently denying any involvement and calling the accusations insane. With neither side backing down and the vandalism now bordering on outright theft, the gnome collector made the decision to involve the police. The officers who responded were faced with one of the more unusual calls of their careers. They were presented with a photo album of spray-painted gnomes and a detailed timeline of ceramic-based crimes. The accused neighbor continued his denials, pointing out the utter absurdity of the situation and the lack of any concrete proof. Without an eyewitness or a clear video of the act, the police were left with little to go on beyond a classic case of he said, she said, albeit one fought with lawn ornaments. They filed a report for criminal mischief and advised both parties to try and resolve their differences civilly, leaving behind a Cold War that had now been officially acknowledged, but no closer to a resolution. This bizarre conflict served as a perfect example of how even the most whimsical of objects can become powerful symbols in a battle of wills, where the real casualty is rarely the property itself, but the fragile piece that once existed between two homes. And so we arrive at the absolute pinnacle of pettiness, the undisputed champion of churlishness, the architectural equivalent of giving your neighbor the middle finger for all eternity, the spite house. If all the disputes we've covered so far represent individual battles in the long, unfortunate war of neighbor against neighbor, then the spite house is the nuclear option. This isn't about moving a fence a few inches, sabotaging a treehouse, or rearranging some garden gnomes. This is about harnessing the immense power of real estate, architecture, and cold, hard cash to construct a permanent, physical monument to your pure, unadulterated hatred. The most legendary American tale of architectural vengeance takes us to the narrow streets of Boston's historic North End in the early 1800s. As the story goes, two wealthy merchant neighbors, whose names have been lost to all but the pettiness they embodied, found themselves locked in a bitter feud. The exact catalyst is murky. Some say it was over a horse, others a perceived business slight, but the result was crystal clear. One of the men, planning an ambitious expansion of his grand home, approached his neighbor to purchase a small sliver of land to complete his vision. The neighbor, seeing an opportunity for maximum spite, refused to sell at any price. Infuriated by this roadblock, the would-be builder decided on the most extravagantly petty revenge imaginable. If he couldn't have the land, then nobody would enjoy it. He commissioned the construction of the thinnest, most absurdly narrow house physically possible on the contested strip. The resulting structure, known forever after as the Skinny House or the Spite House, stands to this day. It's a mere 10 feet wide at its front facade, tapering to a claustrophobic 9 feet at the back, a wedge-shaped brick middle finger designed with one solitary purpose: to loom awkwardly next to the neighbor's property, permanently blocking its light and ruining its view, a daily, inescapable reminder of a grudge that outlived both men. But the phenomenon isn't confined to Boston. In New York City, a different kind of spite house emerged from a feud over air rights and access. The story involves a row of brownstones and a developer who refused to sell his lot to a larger building firm that was assembling a full city block for a massive new project. When the developers went ahead and built their grand apartment building around the man's stubborn holdout, they purposely designed the new structure's foundation and support walls to cut off his light and air, hoping to force him out. Instead of surrendering, the homeowner retaliated in the most New York way possible. He built anyway. The result is a comically narrow building, some claim just 5 feet wide in places, squeezed into the minuscule gap the developers left him. It was a defiant, practically useless sliver of a building that served no real purpose other than to stand as a testament to one man's refusal to be bullied by progress or corporate greed. It was a spite house built not to block a neighbor, but to spite the entire notion that he could be forced out. These structures are fascinating because they transcend a simple property dispute. They become a form of folk art, a physical manifestation of human stubbornness etched into a city's very skyline. They force us to ask profound, almost ridiculous questions about the nature of property ownership. How much is it worth to prove a point? What price do you put on the satisfaction of eternally annoying someone? The builders of these houses invested staggering sums of money, sometimes their entire life savings, not to create a comfortable home for their family, but to construct a tool for psychological warfare. They prioritized the goal of making someone else miserable over their own comfort, often living in bizarre, cramped, and utterly impractical spaces just to maintain their vigil of vengeance. Long after the original feuding parties are dust, their spite houses remain. They've outlasted the passions that built them, transforming from symbols of hatred into quirky tourist attractions and beloved local landmarks. We point them out on walking tours with a chuckle, marveling at the absurd lengths people will go to for revenge. But beneath the quirky facade lies a darker truth. These buildings are permanent scars. They are a frozen moment of pure, uncut animosity, a warning that when a disagreement is left to fester without compromise, it can literally cement itself into the world, shaping the physical environment for generations to come. They are the ultimate testament to the fact that while you can't take it with you with enough determination, you can certainly leave your grudge behind for everyone else to see.